In the bitter, deeply exhausted aftermath of the First World War, the Australian government faced a massive, unprecedented crisis. Thousands of returning, highly traumatized military veterans who desperately needed employment and a way to smoothly reintegrate into civilian society. To solve this overwhelming logistical nightmare, the government implemented the Soldier Settlement Scheme. These hardened veterans, men who had miraculously survived the horrific, muddy trenches of Gallipoli and the Western Front, were generously granted large plots of agricultural land in the extremely remote, fiercely unforgiving Campion district of Western Australia. They were explicitly instructed by the government to cultivate massive, endless fields of wheat, promised a heroic, prosperous new life built on their own hard-working agricultural independence. However, the reality of the harsh Australian outback was a cruel, relentless deception. The land they were given was profoundly marginal, suffering from severe, unpredictable droughts and highly deficient, sandy soil. When the catastrophic, global Great Depression violently struck in 1929, the international price of wheat absolutely plummeted, completely devastating the veterans' already fragile, deeply indebted agricultural economy. The desperate farmers, facing absolute financial ruin, were pushed to the very brink of starvation, frantically pleading with the government for promised subsidies that completely failed to materialize. But the devastating global economic collapse was merely a gentle prelude to a far more immediate, highly destructive, and utterly bizarre biological catastrophe. As the blistering, suffocating summer of 1932 approached, a massive, terrifyingly unstoppable force began to physically mobilize in the deep, arid interior of the continent. Driven by extreme, relentless drought and searching desperately for scarce water and food, a staggering, overwhelming migration of over 20,000 native emus began a rapid, highly organized march directly toward the cultivated, struggling wheat belt of Western Australia. The emu is not a standard, easily frightened agricultural pest. It is a massive, prehistoric-looking, flightless avian behemoth capable of growing up to 6 feet tall, weighing nearly 100 pounds, and sprinting at terrifying speeds exceeding 50 kilometers per hour. When this gargantuan, feathered army finally breached the fragile boundaries of the Campion district, the destruction they unleashed was absolute, biblical, and entirely devastating. The 20,000 giant birds violently descended upon the golden, ready-to-harvest wheat fields like an unstoppable, highly destructive plague of gigantic locusts. They did not simply eat the precious crops, they violently, systematically trampled the delicate wheat stalks into the hard dirt, entirely ruining hundreds of acres of vital food in a matter of mere hours. Furthermore, their immense physical size and sheer, chaotic momentum completely shattered the long, expensive wooden rabbit-proof fences that the farmers had laboriously constructed around their properties. This secondary destruction created massive, gaping holes in the perimeter, allowing tens of thousands of highly destructive wild rabbits to violently flood into the fields, perfectly completing the absolute, devastating eradication of the veterans' entire livelihood. The desperate ex-soldiers, completely overwhelmed by the sheer, terrifying magnitude of the biological invasion, quickly realized that their standard, bolt-action hunting rifles were entirely, laughably inadequate against an organized flock of 20,000 giant, rapidly moving birds. Refusing to watch their families starve, a small, highly determined delegation of these hardened military veterans traveled directly to the capital to meet with Sir George Pearce, the Australian Minister of Defence. They did not ask for agricultural assistance or civilian pest control. Relying on their deep military background, they explicitly demanded the immediate deployment of the Australian Army, specifically requesting the heavy, rapid-fire devastation of Lewis automatic machine guns to violently annihilate the feathered threat. The Australian Minister of Defence, Sir George Pearce, surprisingly agreed to the veterans' bizarre, unprecedented military request, heavily influenced by the undeniable political optics of seemingly supporting struggling World War I heroes. He officially ordered the immediate deployment of a highly specialized, heavily armed military strike force from the 7th Heavy Battery of the Royal Australian Artillery, strictly commanded by a highly experienced, deeply serious officer named Major G.P.W. Meredith. The operation was launched with supreme, absolute military confidence. Major Meredith, accompanied by 2 highly trained, professional soldiers carrying 2 heavy, rapid-fire Lewis automatic machine guns and an incredibly massive stockpile of 10,000 rounds of heavy military ammunition, arrogantly believed the entire operation would be a swift, effortless, and highly publicized slaughter. The Australian press, deeply fascinated by the sheer, undeniable absurdity of the situation, eagerly dubbed the impending conflict the Emu War, entirely expecting the rapid, violent extermination of the birds by the superior, mechanized might of the modern British Empire. However, when the heavily armed military convoy finally arrived in the devastated, dusty agricultural theater of Campion in early November 1932, they immediately, violently collided with a highly unexpected, profoundly humiliating tactical reality. The first major, highly anticipated military engagement occurred on November 2, when the soldiers spotted a large, concentrated flock of roughly 50 emus gathering near an open field. Major Meredith aggressively ordered his men to quietly establish a concealed, heavily fortified machine gun position and open fire. The deafening, rhythmic roar of the heavy Lewis gun suddenly shattered the quiet outback air, unleashing a massive hail of lead directly at the flock. But to the absolute, terrified astonishment of the highly trained soldiers, the giant birds did not simply fall down in a chaotic, bloody massacre. Instead, demonstrating incredible, almost supernatural tactical awareness, the massive flock instantly, violently scattered into dozens of tiny, highly erratic, and rapidly moving splinter groups. Their massive, thick layers of coarse feathers essentially acted as natural, highly effective biological body armor, effortlessly absorbing glancing bullets, while their terrifying, 50 km/h sprinting speed made them absolutely impossible targets for the heavy, cumbersome, and slow-moving military machine guns. After burning through hundreds of rounds of expensive military ammunition, the humiliated soldiers had managed to kill perhaps a dozen birds out of 50. Determined to forcefully regain the tactical advantage and secure a decisive, overwhelming military victory, Major Meredith orchestrated a massive, highly ambitious ambush on November 4. Intelligence indicated that over 1,000 emus were tightly gathered near a local, vital water dam. The soldiers meticulously, quietly established a point-blank, heavily concealed machine gun position, waiting patiently until the massive, tightly packed flock was mere yards away before pulling the heavy trigger. It was the absolute perfect, textbook military kill zone. The heavy Lewis gun roared to life, instantly dropping the first dozen giant birds. But then, in a stroke of absolute, catastrophic mechanical failure, the heavy military machine gun violently jammed, falling completely, agonizingly silent. The remaining 980 emus, instantly alerted by the noise, scattered rapidly into the dense, highly protective scrubland, completely vanishing before the frantic, cursing soldiers could clear the heavy weapons jammed breach. In a final, incredibly desperate, and deeply comical attempt to match the terrifying speed of their feathered enemy, Major Meredith ordered one of the heavy machine guns to be physically mounted onto the back of a moving flatbed truck, intending to ruthlessly chase the birds down in a high-speed, mechanized pursuit. This desperate tactic failed spectacularly. The incredibly rough, heavily cratered terrain of the Australian outback shook the heavy truck so violently that the exhausted gunner could not aim or fire a single shot, and the pursuit was entirely abandoned when a massive, terrified emu violently tangled itself in the truck's steering mechanism, nearly causing a highly fatal, high-speed vehicle crash. By the second week of November 1932, the deeply embarrassing, undeniable reality of the absurd military campaign had become entirely, painfully obvious to the Australian public. Despite expending over 2,500 rounds of heavy, highly expensive military ammunition, Major Meredith's heavily armed, highly trained strike force had managed to officially confirm the deaths of only a few hundred emus out of a massive, seemingly infinite invading force of over 20,000 giant birds. The highly agile, incredibly resilient emus had effectively, effortlessly employed brilliant, decentralized guerrilla warfare tactics, completely neutralizing the overwhelming, mechanized firepower of a modern, professional 20th century army. The Australian media, previously supportive of the struggling farmers, began to relentlessly, fiercely mock the spectacular military failure, publishing highly embarrassing, satirical political cartoons depicting giant, triumphant emus proudly wearing stolen military medals and aggressively chasing terrified, fleeing soldiers across the outback. The humiliating, highly publicized debacle eventually reached the very floor of the Australian Parliament, where politicians furiously debated the profound, unjustifiable waste of valuable military resources and ammunition during the absolute height of the Great Depression. Facing immense, overwhelming public ridicule and an undeniable, absolute tactical defeat, the deeply embarrassed Minister of Defence, Sir George Pearce, ordered the immediate, unconditional withdrawal of the military forces from the agricultural zone. Major Meredith, the deeply frustrated, highly exhausted commanding officer, famously and highly dramatically compared the giant, flightless birds to heavily armored, unstoppable military vehicles, stating to the press, "If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world. They can face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks." The Great Emu War officially concluded with an absolute, undeniable, and entirely humiliating military victory for the avian invaders. The military completely withdrew, completely failing to achieve their primary, highly publicized strategic objective of eradicating the biological threat. The struggling, desperate farmers were once again left entirely alone to fiercely defend their devastated, failing crops against the massive, ongoing migration. However, the Australian government, having entirely learned a deeply painful, highly public lesson about the absolute futility of deploying conventional military tactics against the chaotic, resilient forces of native nature, finally implemented a far more practical, highly effective, and deeply traditional solution to the agricultural crisis. Instead of deploying heavy, cumbersome machine guns and professional artillerymen, the government instituted a massive, highly lucrative bounty system. They explicitly provided the desperate farmers with a steady, massive supply of heavily subsidized ammunition and offered a direct, significant financial cash reward for every single confirmed emu killed. This completely decentralized, highly incentivized approach proved to be absolutely devastating. Driven by the powerful, desperate need for immediate financial survival during the crushing depression, the highly skilled, individual farmers completely eradicated the biological threat. Within a mere 6 months of the bounty system's implementation, over 57,000 incredibly fast, highly resilient emus were systematically hunted and killed by the locals, permanently, violently ending the massive agricultural crisis that the heavily armed military had spectacularly failed to solve. Today, the Great Emu War remains one of the most bizarre, highly entertaining, and deeply absurd chapters in global military history. It stands as a profound, darkly comedic, and highly enduring testament to the sheer, terrifying resilience of the rugged Australian environment, and a brilliant, unforgettable reminder of the profound, deeply humiliating limits of human hubris when attempting to violently declare war on the chaotic, unstoppable forces of the natural world.